Greetings everybody, my name is Tommy the Game Master and welcome to my channel. Well, the Cowabunga collection was released a few weeks ago and I may, if I have time, go over that complete collection. It is a huge collection after all, and I only played half of these games. I did want to take time though and talk about a game I couldn't talk about 8 years ago when I did my Teenaged Mutant Ninja Turtles game series, because I didn't have the cartridge available. Going back through them with the Cowabunga collection, I might do a redo on those reviews one of these days. But in the meantime, let's talk about Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade port. Now, my history with this game is like this. When I was about 8 years old, my mother took me to the store and asked me to pick out an NES game. As a Turtle fan and someone who only had his NES for a couple of months and also played the arcade game a few times, I jumped at the chance to play it and proudly picked up Teenaged Mutant Ninja Turtles, and going home and finding out I got the wrong game despite a friend being there at the time warning me that I was about to get a game out of my depth and not get the game that I thought I was getting, because just turning 8-year-old me did not know that there were two Turtle games for the NES. So, a few months later, when my mom wanted to get me another NES game, this time I made sure to get the right Turtles game. And then I had to wait 10 painstaking days to go home to play my NES, because at the time I lived with my grandparents when school was in session. Anyways, I played it, and I loved this port as a kid. I recognized a few things were different from the arcade port, but it was a fun game, and it took me many months to beat. Now that it's out in the Cowabunga collection, is it worth playing now that we have a pretty much arcade perfect port complete with music, and it includes all the cutscenes included in the same Cowabunga collection? The answer to that question, in my opinion, is yes. The NES version is absolutely worth playing, and I think even a better game than the arcade version. Just keep in mind that you're going to have to compromise, and this isn't Turtles in Time for the Super Nintendo when it comes to port quality. Before we talk about the rest of the game though, let's talk about the arcade version real fast. When it comes to doing the comparison between the arcade version and the NES game, it's important to realize Konami in the late 80s and early 90s knew their audiences and knew their audience well as known that their audience would be different when it came to selling the two games. You see, the arcade version, it wasn't sold to us gamers, it wasn't sold to us Turtle fans. It was sold to arcade owners. Please spend several $100s in 1990s money and a good chunk of space in your arcade for our arcade cabinet, and we can promise you so many quarters that your employees will be complaining about back problems getting them all to the bank. Because of that, the arcade game is a bit of a quarter muncher. The balance is towards you making progress at the beginning, but as the game progresses, things get ridiculously cheap. And if you want to continue and defeat the Shredder, you're going to have to keep paying up. And I mean pay up a lot. Yet, each time you press start in the Cowabunga collection, imagine having to put a quarter to an arcade machine. Throw in 4-player co-op, and yeah, that machine was very profitable, I'm sure. However, because of the high difficulty curve and just how easy it is to die, especially in later stages, and how easy it is to continue when you take away the 25-cent asking price, is a game that's going to be ridiculously hard to have a good NES version without some serious rebalancing. Altered Beast for the Sega Genesis is what it's like when you bring an arcade game home completely perfect and don't give yourselves any continues. It's why that game sucks, in my opinion. And the answer to these ports nowadays, like in Capcom's Final Fight for example, is to keep having free play mode on, giving you unlimited continues, which personally I find kind of boring. So, when it comes to the home port, you're going to have to rebalance things. Make sure that you have more life. Make sure that the stages are longer. Make sure that the penalties for game over are a lot more severe. And Konami does that rebalancing perfectly here. Throw in some of the other limitations of the NES, and the way Konami cheated their way around them is almost perfect. It just shows that there was a lot of love and care when it comes to those two versions. So remember, when I say NES standards and compromise, it wasn't because Konami wasn't trying. It was the fact that they poured a lot of love into this port, that they wanted to make sure that people had a good experience. Is why this port works out so well. Even in the Cowabunga collection, when you have its big, more powerful version sitting right next to it in the menu, that this is still worth playing, says something. Let's start talking about this port, and let's start going on with the story. The story is pretty much the same as the arcade game. The turtles see April's apartment is on fire and they jump over and enter the burning building to rescue her. Then they fight some foot soldiers and beat up Rocksteady, and then watch April do what April does best, get kidnapped by the Shredder. And for those who are calling me a misogynist, I'm going to say this. Peach only got kidnapped in 2 of the Mario games for the NES. April manages to get kidnapped by Shredder in all 3 of the NES games. She's only spared a kidnapping in the Tournament Fighters only because I don't think there was much room on the cartridge for everything else Konami shoved into them to have a kidnapping plot. Anyways, from there it's battling through streets, sewers, frozen ice fields, parking lots until you rescue April. Then battling through more streets and saving Splinters, and a dojo to find the Technodrome and fight Shredder and Krang. The story is an 8-bit brawler. There are some very small blink and you miss them cutscenes, but for the most part it's going from one stage to the other with only a stage name showing up to give you an idea of what's going on. Speaking about that, the last stage says you need to find the Technodrome when you're already inside it. That's kind of bad storytelling, but at least they fixed the typos that the arcade game have. What the heck is Dimension X, by the way? Again, looking for silky smooth battles where you can button mash combos? Yeah, not happening here. But what you do get is a really balanced out game that I think as a 1 or 2 player experience is really fun and it makes the game better. The enemies go down in 2 hits unless you do a special whack by pressing both A and B at almost the same time. It takes a bit of practice to do, and it's harder to do on a modern controller than it was on the NES. But when you smack them, they gain momentary invincibility and go flying back a bit. What does this mean? Rather than comboing, you gotta stick and move, making a bit more strategy and a bit more fun battling the foot. That said, these roadkill Rodneys can be dealt with easier by mashing them into a corner, making you again change strategy based on the enemies you face. And the NES version brings on more types of enemies as well. You got snowmen, these ninja robots, tigers, and scorpion tanks to deal with now that we're in the arcade. Each one of these you'll have to develop new strategies in order to deal with and win. And I should mention, Konami added extra sections to the existing stages and made 2 whole new ones and put more enemies in those stages, again to make you use more strategy and increasing the difficulty in a more organic way. Using no cheats and not giving yourself 10 lives, this could be a bit difficult to beat, but you never feel like you were being robbed of lives or that the deaths were cheap. You were given enough help to get through a stage if you use strategy and beating the enemies and learning the patterns. Yes, game overs will send your butt back to the beginning a few times if you're not using that 10 life cheat code or, heaven forbid, God mode. And I do recommend more experienced gamers who haven't played the NES game and are picking it up on the Cowabunga collection not to use the 10 life cheat right away, and never turn on God mode until after you legitimately beat the game, because that just takes out all the challenge and fun. It's a game that takes a while to get good, but it does it like a good NES game. It's NES hard, but not in a bad way. The extra stages and bosses are fun, and the downscaling of the animation was done correctly, so you might not have the smooth combos, but you have strategy in the end if you're playing it. As a one-player game on the NES port, this is the one you should be playing if you're playing it by yourself. That said, if you got 4 players, then yeah, the arcade game is a lot more fun with all 4 turtles. Just don't do it online. The Cowabunga collections online is bad. Consider this your warning. Start talking about the graphics between the NES and arcade version. One has an animation that mimics the cartoon show. One tries but really doesn't. One has fully colored bosses and a lot more animation. The other does not. One has fully colored background. The other abuses black, white, and gray a whole lot. One, if you set it to the original mode on the Cowabunga collection, flickers more than an apartment complex lights when I decide to turn on all my gaming consoles on at once. Yes, the arcade game's graphics are better than the NES version. I won't argue with that here. Except for April. Yeah, the sprite is smaller, but she's actually more animated, and she has a face that appears somewhat human. The face of April in the arcade game looks like a ghoul who is hiding out in the Turtles arcade game to escape from Simon Belmont. I mean, what the heck is that? Ew. But you have to look at what the console this was for. And when you realize it, you do kind of realize it's a bit of a technical marvel that Konami was able to do this faithful of an arcade port. The turtle sprites are large, a lot larger than most NES sprites, and they're almost as large as their arcade counterparts. The details of the background and stage design are almost perfect to the arcade, so they are lacking a bit of color, but they are there and recognizable. And the game, despite some slowdown, does run for the most part smoothly. Again, more smoothly on the Cowabunga collection if you turn on those enhancements. And unless you're either A, really nostalgic about NES limitations, or doing a YouTube recording session, I do recommend turning on those enhancements. For an NES game in the early 90s, this game looks really good. The enemy sprites again may not be as colorful as the arcade, still function like the arcade and are as large as the arcade, and from the NES, well animated. Look at Rocksteady and how huge he is and how much animation he has. It's almost forgivable that he has next to no color on him. That said, to say the developers didn't cheat either when they could, only 3 enemies at a time, so kill one and another one will jump in to take its place. And yeah, a fight with both Rocksteady and Bebop in the same screen. Yeah, no, not happening on the NES. So instead, we get an extra fight with Baxter Stockman in his fly form. Still, the way Konami took the arcade port, was able to shrink it down and still have to look at this good is amazing. When it comes to the music, Konami did a great job reworking the soundtrack for the NES. All the music from the arcade game is here and recognizable, although now done in an 8-bit chiptunes, and Konami was known for their masterful 8-bit chiptunes back in the 80s. I would even argue that the music and the tunes here are more memorable on the NES than they were on the arcades. With that said, unfortunately there are no sound clips. There is no shell-shocked, for example, when you die, or even Shredder laughing. But the great music makes up for it. I do have to applaud them a bit on the sound design. I wish there was just a little bit more memory on those old cartridges just to have a few sound samples, especially with Shredder laughing not being available. In the end, Teenaged Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 does not match the arcade game on a technical level. However, Konami did a masterful job of porting it to the NES, and this feels more like a game that should be played at home. You gotta dig deep for it on the Cowabunga collection, but once you find it, you'll find that it has a bunch of enhancements over the original NES port. The two big ones to turn on is the no slowdown and the no sprite flicker. Play it with this on and I do believe it's actually a bit better 1 or 2 player experience than the actual arcade game. With that said, the original arcade game is better if you can get all 4 turtles to join in. Just find a way to do it locally because the online for the Cowabunga collection is not great. In fact, it's one of the worst online experiences I've ever had, which is kind of a shame because the Xbox Live version of Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, was way better than this. I hope Konami and Digital Eclipse get this fixed soon.